Hello. Recently I had a firearms check. I live in New South Wales, near Armidale, and a member of the Armidale, New South Wales Police Service came out to my house to check my firearms and to check my firearms safe. This particular policeman did not know the difference between a muzzle loading firearm and a breech loading firearm. He could not tell which of my guns were antiques and which were not antiques, and he did not know enough about gun legislation, the New South Wales firearms legislation, because he told me that my antique guns in fact needed registering. Now, to my mind, anyone who's going to do a firearms check should at least know general information about firearms, and they should know the firearms legislation for the state that they are working in. I was told that I had to register my antiques, which, if you know the New South Wales legislation, you will know that that is not the case. You do not need a licence and you do not need registration for antique firearms made before 1900 that you do not intend to use. So this video is an educational video to show you the difference between the firearms. Now, I would also like to state that the New South Wales firearms legislation does not distinguish between a muzzle loading firearm, which is a flintlock, and a modern breech loading firearm. This is a flintlock. This is the cock on the Glock, and in it has a piece of flint. This is the hammer, also known as a steel, and the flint strikes against the steel to make a spark which falls in the pan, which makes this gun work. It is not the sort of gun you would use to hold up a bank or to shoot a lot of people all at once, because it is a single shot firearm and it loads from the muzzle. You cannot load it from the breech. The breech is sealed. But this firearm is classed in the same category as this firearm. This is a breech loader. You can see right through the barrels and out of the muzzle, and it loads modern cartridges in the breech. This is the particular firearm that the police officer told me was a breech loader. You cannot see through the barrels because the breech is blocked. It has two nipples on the back, and it has two breech plugs, and you can't even remove these breech plugs because they're separate, and you have two barrels that are fixed together. That's the muzzle. That's where you have to load from. You cannot load from the breech end. Okay, that is the difference. This is a muzzle loader. You cannot load from the breech end. This is a breech loader. You can load it from the breech end. Now I can understand him not being able to tell the difference between an antique and a non-antique. As it happens, on my antiques, the names of the makers are on top of the barrel, and it is quite obvious by looking at them that they are in fact very old guns. However, that aside, I can understand, as I said, that he did not know the difference. The reason being is that manufacture-wise, the way these are made and the way they operate, there is no difference. A flintlock made today will look much like a flintlock made before 1900. It operates the same way. It has the same lock. It has to be loaded from the muzzle. It is a true muzzle loader. It has to use black powder. There is no difference between this one, which is a modern made flintlock, and an antique flintlock. And yet, the New South Wales firearms legislation distinguishes between this one and an antique, even though there is no difference other than its date of manufacture. Also, as I said earlier, this gun, a flintlock, is classed the same as a breech lock, a breech loading shotgun. In other words, you need the same license for a flintlock as you need for this. Now, how ridiculous is that? If an antique firearm made before 1900 does not require a license or registration, then I don't see why a modern made firearm of the same type should require a license and registration. However, I can understand why any firearm should require a license, because you need to be trained in the use of firearms before you use them. And I don't think it's right that anyone can walk into a shop and purchase an antique gun without knowing how to use it. I don't see the difference between using an antique firearm and not using it. What I mean is, it's in your possession already. You already have it. If you say you're not going to use it, then you don't need a license or registration. If you say you are going to use it, then you need a license and registration. Now, does that make sense? It doesn't to me. It doesn't to me. I think that everyone should have a license if they're going to own a gun. I don't see the point in having to register a firearm if it's a muzzleloader. You do not need a permit to acquire for an antique firearm, but you do need a permit to acquire a flintlock muzzle-loading gun that looks like an antique. It would be much simpler. Everybody would understand it. It would be much simpler for the police to check your guns if all muzzle loaders were on a separate licence, and you were licensed for a muzzle loader, and it didn't matter whether they were antiques or not antiques. They are a muzzle loader, and these guns should be the last guns that anyone should consider banning. Now, I have always been pro-gun, but this is the first video I have ever made on actual telling people about firearms and the legislation. Up until now, I've let it ride. I think most people who own the average gun, like a shotgun or a .22 rifle, would be quite happy if they could just keep those firearms, and they really don't want to own a submachine gun. They don't have a use for it. And I have to say that I don't see why the general public, anyone in the general public, has a use for a submachine gun. I can see where semi-automatics are very handy, but at the same time, it would not worry me if I could only own a Bruno bolt action, for instance, which is the case now. The semi-automatics have been banned. So that's not a big deal, not for me. But what is a big deal is the fact that the government now has a foot in the door. And I get the feeling that they're not going to stop banning things, banning guns, banning knives, banning axes, until there are none left in the community. And we all know what that means. The only people that will have these things are the bad guys. Because the bad guys are not worried about licensing, they're not worried about registering, they're not worried about obeying the law. So they will have knives, axes and guns, and we will have nothing. And the government thinks that this will stop crime. I fail to understand that. It seems quite clear that if a criminal has a gun, knife and an axe, then he is free to commit crimes with those weapons, with those tools. We're unable to use them at all if we don't have them. So we can't even, well, dare I say, defend ourselves. I'm not really supposed to say that, because you're not actually allowed to defend yourself here in New South Wales unless you've already been shot. This is not good. I am unable to make much sense out of the New South Wales firearms legislation. Anyway, that's about it for today. I just wanted to point out the differences between breechloaders and muzzleloaders, and I hope there are some policemen out there that are actually watching this and listening to this, because you're the guys that come into our homes, and if you don't know one gun from the other, it makes it very difficult for us. This situation with the policeman that came into my house and doesn't know the difference between a muzzleloader and a breechloader has cost me money and time. I've had to find a gunsmith, which was not easy in these parts. I tracked him down, and he has identified my antiques as being genuine antiques. It was pretty easy to do. It's pretty obvious. As far as the legislation is concerned, all I could do there was show the constable that was involved in the firearms check, and he still didn't believe me. He said he was going to go away and check and let me know. I'm not worried about that because it's quite straightforward. The legislation, although it is open to misinterpretation in a lot of places, that part of it is not open to misinterpretation. You are not required to register antique firearms made before 1900, especially muzzleloaders. So there it is. There's a piece of education. I hope that, as I said, some policemen are actually watching this video and they go to the trouble of actually learning a bit more about firearms, and they read through the important parts of the legislation regarding the gun checks, so that when they walk into a home and they see these firearms that are obviously not modern guns, they are not breech loaders, use some common sense. If we'd been talking here about semi-automatics or even modern breech-loading guns, then I could have understood some concern on the part of this policeman. But what we're talking about here is muzzle-loading firearms, one of which doesn't work and never will work again. It's just too damaged and too old. And yet, he made a report on it. Lost for words, really. Let's try and keep things real here. These are not the important things about firearms and crime. When criminals all swap over to use muzzle loaders and start robbing banks, then I'll say you have some concerns. But until that day, I think you should leave us guys and our muzzleloaders alone, frankly, and just let us get on with enjoying life. Thank you.